Hi, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this conversation with my St. Louis colleague, Matt Burton. So tonight on this Spotlight seminar, we're going to talk about the future of gaming. And I'm really delighted that Matt's joining us all the way from St. Louis. And to tell you a little bit about him, in addition to self-publishing over 10 titles to the iOS and Google Play app stores, Matt has played a key role in the development of the educational software program Bloxels, which won the New York Toy Fair Toy of the Year. Matt now uses his experiences as a game developer to share his passion and knowledge of game design, coding, and production with his students. And tonight he's here to share some of that passion and knowledge with us. So Matt, thanks for being here. To start us off, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely, Sarah, and thank you so much for having me. Yeah, like Sarah said, my name is Matt Burton. I'm an assistant professor with the game design program at Webster University in St. Louis. So currently I teach here in St. Louis, but I'm lucky enough to be joining everyone in Geneva this coming fall, which I very much look forward to. A little bit about my background. I started building mobile games about 8 years ago or so. I learned some programming from my first job out of college, and I really wanted to put that to the test by building video games. Building video games was something that I always wanted to do, but doing that is incredibly intimidating. You have so many moving parts. You have art, you have sound, you have coding. And once I learned to do that, I kind of just fell in love with the process and started building mobile games because they focus on kind of a simple mechanic, and they're generally smaller in terms of scope. So I felt that was a good way to start building games on smaller projects. So my games started doing quite well. I got a good amount of downloads, some good exposure. One of my games called Ninjavade was ranked #1 on IndieDB.com, which was a website that did some articles and features on all sorts of games from indie developers. And I got some exposure from some events I did in St. Louis. One of them was at the St. Louis Science Center, where I ran into the CEO of Pixel Press, who just happened to be a huge pinball fanatic. And one of my games also happened to be a pinball game. We really hit it off. He invited me to lunch. And after the lunch, I started working at Pixel Press, which, Sarah, you mentioned we worked on the game called Bloxels. So Bloxels is a video game building platform where you can build levels and characters on a physical board. If you think about Legos or what is it, Lite-Brite? If our audience is old enough to remember what that is, you can basically piece different colors in different areas on a physical board and then take a picture of it with a smart device, your smartphone or an iPad, and it becomes a character or level in your video game. So I learned a lot about different game engines, different game design technologies, augmented reality, game design philosophy. And I've been fortunate enough to bring those skill sets and those experiences to Webster, which is where I've been for the past 2 years. I teach about 8 classes now, generally more technology based, more about how to build games. And yeah, that's where I am now.
Thanks. So before we talk about what's next in gaming, it might be a good idea to discuss where the world of game design is today. So could you tell us about some recent gaming and game design trends that you've noticed?
Sure. I think the biggest change in gaming from the past 10 years is the dependency to having an internet connection with your game. So the online integration. If you take the example with Xbox 360 was the relevant console 10 years ago. You could just buy a game from a store, you buy a physical copy, put it in your Xbox, hit play, and you could play the game whether you had internet or not. So fast forward to 10 years, now you have the Xbox One and the Xbox One Series X. You absolutely need an online connection to play any sort of game. So there's a few reasons that we've gone down this route. And one of them is the ability to submit updates for games. And if you think about it, you can submit an update or a patch or a new feature for a game at any time, which makes it really convenient for developers to keep their game up to date, making sure it always works. However, with all technology, if you use it the correct way, it can be a benefit to everybody. but you can also abuse it to the point where it becomes more of a hindrance to your games. For anybody who's paid attention to the gaming industry in the past 4 or 5 years, you might have heard about Fallout 76 and Cyberpunk 2077. Both of those games were released about 2 years too early. And unfortunately, we've kind of gotten to the mindset of release now, fix later. So both of those games released with just a suite of bugs to the point where it's almost unplayable. And they've been patching on bug fixes and features and updates for the past 2 years to make it be the game that it always should have been. So even though we can fix updates over time and it can provide a benefit to games to make sure that they're always up to date and working, we can also abuse that power. So in addition to the ability to publish and update at any time, that online integration has also introduced the subscription model for games. So if you think about the ways movies have worked, maybe in the 2010s, generally people were buying DVDs and putting them into their DVD drive and press and play. Now we have Netflix and Amazon Prime, and man, there's probably a dozen or so online streaming services that have come to being in the past few years. So that model is also coming to fruition with games. We have Xbox with their Game Pass, and PlayStation just announced their subscription service. So instead of buying physical copies of games or downloading a $60 copy of a digital version of the game, you can now subscribe to a pass that gets you a backlog of games that you can play at any time. So this is kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but with this online integration, everything's becoming digital, everything's becoming more accessible for publishers and for game developers. So the ability to publish games has been incredibly, it's been much more accessible as of late. One example there is the price comparison of the developer kits. So if you were to publish games for the Xbox 10 years ago, you had to buy a developer kit that cost $10,000, up to $10,000, just to test your game on a console and then publish it. So fast forward to today, it's maybe a few $100, a few hundred US dollars to buy a developer license for the Xbox, test your game, and then publish it. So with that, you can also, there's also just so many, since everything's so much more accessible, everything's cheaper, everything's online, more people can publish. There's been a saturation of games in the market as well. So that could be a good thing because everybody can publish their games. You can get exposure more easily that way as a developer, but also there's just so many more games to sort through before you find a game you might want to play. If you look at Steam, Steam is a marketplace for PC games. 10 years ago in 2011, just over 300 games were published to Steam. Fast forward to 2021, over 10,000 games were published to Steam. So in 10 years, the amount of games went times 30 in that market. So many more games are being published. We kind of live in an era of just more and more content all the time. But also we get to see cooler games and more games, which isn't always a bad thing.
So in addition to all these gaming trends, what are some recent gaming technologies that have been introduced?
So probably the biggest new gaming technology that's been growing over the past 5 years is extended reality. So extended reality is the umbrella term for augmented reality, or AR, and virtual reality, VR. And VR technology has grown quite a bit in the past 5 years. So maybe 5 years ago, VR headsets, you could get a good one for about $600 US, but you had to tether it to your PC. Your PC also had to be very capable of running these VR headsets, games. That would be another $2,000 at least. And the games were a little bit clunky, and you also could only move left, right, up, and down, and you couldn't really lean in and have that sense of immersion. So nowadays, the most recent relevant VR headset is the Oculus Quest 2. So the Oculus Quest 2 does not need to be tethered to a PC. It can run standalone. It has all the hardware, all the visuals, the game marketplace, all built within the headset. So you don't need to buy extra equipment to run it. It starts at about $300, so about half of the price of what they were 6 years ago. And they also include 6 degrees of freedom, which I spoke about the earlier VR headsets. You can move left, right, up, down, and look around your world. But with the new headsets, you have 6 degrees of freedom, meaning you can move up and down, and you can lean into things. And if you imagine a highly detailed world, maybe you have a wall with pictures and little notes about what you should be doing. You can actually lean in and read things on the wall. So your simulations in your games become much more immersive with those 6 degrees of freedom. So in addition, we also have augmented reality games. So I'm sure you've heard of Pokemon Go, and that just shows you like Nintendo and big companies are starting to get into these worlds with AR and VR. One of those big companies is also Valve. They make the Half-Life series, which is one of the biggest gaming franchises in history, one of the most critically acclaimed ones. And they're one of the first companies to create a fully functional AAA release, game release for virtual reality. It's called Half-Life Alyx. So in summary, the biggest gaming technologies are probably virtual reality and augmented reality as of late.
Is there something else that we're hearing a lot about lately is artificial intelligence? How do you see artificial intelligence playing a role in the future of gaming?
Sure. So I think a lot of people, I've been asked this question, like, do you think artificial intelligence beings or entities will actually design games in the future? And I think we're still quite a bit away from that. I think to have a well-designed game, you need some soul, you need some human thought put into it. But there is still room for AI to contribute to the process of developing quality games. And I think one of those ways is through something called machine learning. So if you ever played something like Mario Kart, you've seen machine learning in action, most likely. So what that entails is you might have an AI with some bare bones mechanics run a course, and it can use ray casting to determine where the edge of the track is and know when to turn. And you can essentially have this AI run this track 10,000 times or 1,000,000 times, and it gets smarter and smarter over time. And this has been around for a while, but to incorporate machine learning 10 years ago was incredibly difficult. You had to write 10,000 or so lines of code, whereas now the relevant game engines like Unity and Unreal, they kind of have drag and drop applications and functionality to make machine learning more cookie cutter, and you can whip something up in just a few minutes to create some AI for your game. So AI can help with machine learning, making the non-playable characters and the competition in your games more lively and more realistic. But in addition, AI can also be used to test applications. So this is a background. This is something I come from. I started off after college with a job in quality assurance, and they actually weren't hiring people that could just, click some buttons and make sure it's not broken. They're hiring people who could write code to test things. So if you think of an example in gaming, I'm thinking of one for Elder Scrolls that I saw. There was one spot in the world where you could fall through, but they didn't know where that hole in that world was. So instead of having a human run around this virtual world for 20 hours, this quality assurance engineer wrote some code to create an AI that would go up and down in a grid pattern until they found the hole. Once that hole was found, that AI entity gave feedback to the developer as to where that is. So test automation is going to be huge. Automation in general is going to be huge in the future. But yeah, in summary, I think those are the two biggest things: machine learning and testing. And then much farther in the future, maybe 20 years or so, we might start talking about AI helping design gameplay.
Okay, so you're not out of a job just yet with that one.
Not exactly, not quite yet.
So another kind of technology we hear a lot about is cloud-based solutions. Do you think this technology will include video games in the future?
Right. So a lot of things are supported on the cloud now. We were talking earlier about Netflix, how all those movies are just hosted on the cloud, which is basically somebody else's server or somebody else's computer, and you just stream that data to your own device. So this has already begun with gaming. The biggest example of this is Google Stadia. And you can play AAA games, very high fidelity games, through a streaming service, which is Google Stadia. And the way it works is, if you imagine your high-end gaming PC, this is very expensive. Same with the PlayStation 5 and newer Xboxes. They have very high-end hardware that can run these games. So essentially, they still have this same high-end hardware, but it's just on the cloud, and it runs that game, and then it just streams the visuals and the audio back to whatever device you have. So that could be your smartphone, a computer monitor with a PC that might not be quite as capable as a gaming PC. And you can play very high-end games through streaming, which is pretty incredible to think about, that all these signals are just going to space and back, and you can play anything on any device at any time. However, there is some competition currently with just local storage. So if you think about how much it costs to get a 128 gig micro SD card that's this small, you can get that for $20 or so. So the streaming has to compete with just physical storage and people already being acclimated to their own devices. But also there's a relationship between graphical fidelity and the ability to stream. So if you think about how big of a file size a large game is, we're now using 4K textures and more realistic lighting. That's all taking up a lot of space on the computing device, that whatever's running it. So you also have to stream that data and send it. So you're really reliant on your connection speed. And I don't think the connection speed, the internet speeds that we have currently, are enough to make that a smooth experience, which Google Stadia's success has kind of spoken to that. It caught on quickly when it first started coming out, but people opted to use their own devices because the streaming service couldn't provide a consistent experience. So 90% of the time your game might run well, but 10% of the time it would be choppy because of latency or because of some sort of internet bottleneck. So there's still some work to be done in that area. I don't think cloud gaming will be a hit and universally accepted and used right away, but I think in 10 years or so, it'll be much more common.
Yeah, today, if we look at the fidelity of graphics in gaming, it's so impressive. It's almost lifelike. What does that mean for the future of games?
This is something I'd really like to expand on, because it's one of the reasons I got into teaching game design. I love teaching games and game design, but the technology used to build games is going to be used in so many things in the future, and currently already is. So one of the things these high-end graphics are used for is architecture. I've been in contact with a company in St. Louis. They're called Another Reality Studio, and one of their biggest clients is Clayco, which is an architecture firm. And a problem that they had at Clayco was they would design the blueprints of these buildings and go through it, in sketches, and then somewhat high fidelity renders on the computer, build it. And then almost all the times they would have some sort of expense to go back and fix these issues that they might have had with the building after it was already built. So what this company, Another Reality Studio, is doing is they're importing these blueprints into a program they called Looking Glass, and this allows the architects to actually navigate this building that they've designed on paper and determine scope, move around the building and say, oh, maybe that pipe should actually go over there. So instead of seeing it on a 2D computer screen, they can actually go into these buildings before they build it and determine what they should do to make this the best building experience possible. We can also look at, let's see, BMW is using these high fidelity graphics to model their cars, to make sure that this is how I want the car to look before I actually go into production. So they're saving some costs there. And then the biggest thing I wanted to show you guys, actually I want to show you a video on this. It's called virtual production.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit about virtual production. If you can imagine, maybe behind me, I have a giant curved wall, and green screens were used for this very frequently, but now we're going into something called virtual production. And if you can imagine, on this green screen, we have a very high fidelity world. That's all built in something, a game engine called Unreal. And it can work with in studio. Instead of going to, maybe we're going to a national park and we need the exact right settings. We need it to be a rainy day with lots of lightning. So instead of banking on the chances of having that exact setting, you can create that in virtual reality and have it part of your set. So I'm going to share a video really quick to better demonstrate what I mean.
Great, let's cut and reset. No matter what the project is, the creatives always want to see the closest representation to the final product as early on in the creative process.
When I first walked on the set and the wall was up and we started to look through the camera, it really started to feel like I was just filming in this actual location.
We can track a camera's position in space in real time and render its perspective so that we can compellingly convince a camera that something else is happening in front of it that really isn't there.
The thing to keep in mind is that the 3D world that you see on the wall is also a 3D scene that you can manipulate in Unreal Engine. So this gives the filmmakers full flexibility to make any change they want to the scene live.
So it's really exciting to see that we can, use the real-time lighting to not only change the environments virtually, but also have it affect the on-set lighting as well. This opens up kind of like a virtual playground to shoot in.
We've tried to expand the engine to be a very collaborative platform. So the director of photography, the director, they can all go into the scene and make modifications as they wish, as opposed to waiting for months and months.
In this new frontier of virtual production, the filmmaker is more grounded into the scene that they're shooting, into the story they're trying to tell.
Because you can interactively change the world, it brings all of those departments together because each one of them has a role in how this world is portrayed at some point along in the production.
It's been my dream to get computer graphics to the point that they're totally photoreal, and I've loved video games and movies all my life, and this is bringing the best of them together.
All right, so I don't know if you noticed, but there's also some parallax scrolling effect going on. As the camera was moving, the background of that Unreal Engine world was moving with the camera. So to give you that very hyper-realistic look. So everything in that background was created with Unreal Engine, which initially was just a game engine. And now it's being used for everything I mentioned, architecture, automotive, building cars in this world to make it look better than ever before you go into production, and now virtual production. So this cuts the cost on numerous things, and I think the possibilities are really endless with this. You can create worlds that you could otherwise not go to in real life, and at the same time, cut a lot of costs and time in the production process.
Thanks for sharing that video, Matt. That's really impressive to see the results that can be achieved. Maybe you can put yourself back on the big screen so we can see you. Thanks, there you are. You were telling us before about the technology and how that's advanced in terms of virtual reality. But what makes virtual reality development a valuable skill to learn?
Sure. So I think the common and obvious one is games, and the game market for virtual reality has grown quite a bit in the past few years. But you can also utilize virtual reality technology for film and photography. So with 360 cameras, you can view your films and photography in virtual reality better than ever. Virtual meetings are starting to become a thing. I think we're all going into a more virtual world, and to have the most realistic experience, if you can't be in person, would be with virtual reality. And I think one of the biggest things is simulations. And we were talking about this before we started our chat, was being able to simulate different environments for training purposes or for coping mechanisms. I know of some VR simulations for surgery, for combat training. There's even a dating simulation, which is being created by the same company I mentioned, another reality studio, all the way to oil rigs and radio tower work simulations. So if you think about working on an oil rig, you make one wrong move and you could literally, explode the plant, hurt somebody, hurt yourself. So this company, another reality studio, is creating a simulation for oil rigs to be able to train these employees in virtual reality before they go on site and potentially make a pretty horrible mistake. So I actually have a video for that too, if you guys were interested in seeing that.
Yeah, sure, go ahead, thanks.
Sure. Let's see. Okay. So this is kind of a sizzle reel of the different simulations and training software that this company has created. Sweet. Okay, so I just want to share a bit about that. I believe the first one you saw was for a systems engineer for Cisco and working with servers, because like we were mentioning, if you do this in real life, you have some risk. And if you put this environment in virtual reality, you're eliminating that risk. So instead of plugging a server that might bring down a whole company, you can do all this training in virtual reality to minimize the risks and also save some time and cost. And then you saw another one for a radio tower. So just creating the most hyper-realistic environment that you can to train these employees. And you can put them in this environment to, pick up the right equipment. They even have some simulations on training employees on how to climb the ladders to get to the top of radio towers, which I would want some training before I ever do that. So it's good that they're making these kind of simulations.
Thanks for sharing that, Matt. So with all this potential for new technologies, what about the older technologies? Do you think there's still a future for 2D games and for non-VR games?
Absolutely, yeah. If you look at, let's see, I believe GDC, the Game Developers Conference, 2 years ago, the game of the year was a game called Hades, which is just a top-down 2D game that beat out other very hyper-realistic 3D games. So I guess the thing to take away there is that good game design is never going to go out of style. There is still room for these very hyper-realistic games, but there's also going to be an audience for every type of game.
Thanks, Matt. And with all these developments, what do you think makes game design a relevant topic to practice compared to something like a business degree? Is this going to be something that's going to pick up in terms of what students might choose to study, or that's in demand with employers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think number one, if game design is interesting to you, that would make it a good degree to pursue. I think you have to love what you do. That's the only way to learn, I believe. And game design is incredibly fun. But if we're talking about, working and making a career out of this, one example is the games industry today. It has doubled in revenue in the last 6 years. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry. You also learn just a huge variety of skill sets designing games. And we mentioned this earlier, building games. Games are made up of so many different pieces. There's art, there's sound effects, there's animation, there's music, there's coding, there's working with teams. So breaking down all those different skill sets and learning the software to make those items is incredibly valuable. It's also just a load of fun. It's very challenging and competitive. If you look at AAA game companies, they're hiring the best of the best. So I will say you have to work very, very hard and really, really love it to obtain a job in the games industry. But outside of game development, you're learning a lot of skills that are relevant to just a huge variety of companies. So one of them is coding. That's a background. That's something I've a lot of experience with. And we do a lot of coding to design games. It's what gives games their guts and behavior. But obviously you can use coding to do so many different things, building websites, creating AI, any type of software application. And then also good user interface and UX design. So knowing how a menu should interact with its application, where each button might exist, that's something that we teach in our game design program. And it's useful in not only games, but if you're ever designing a website or any application that you use digitally, knowing those skills is incredibly important. And then the soft skills. So not only are we learning, how to code, how to create animations, how to use these different game engines, we're working with teams every second. So having the soft skills, showing up on time, being able to resolve conflicts with your teams, staying on track to fulfill an audience's need with a timeline, those are all things that we do in our game design program.
Okay, thanks, Matt. That sounds like a really useful and holistic skill set that you gain through gaming. I'd like to open up, actually, if anyone else would like to ask any questions to Matt.
I have a couple of questions. I don't know if it.
Yeah, Francesco. I think you can. Go ahead, Francesco.
Well, two questions. One is about the what we saw before, the turbine and the simulation. Are you aware if it is used or not in surgery, like trying to do something on human bodies before actually doing it?
I have seen simulations of that. I don't know if they've put it into practice yet, but yeah, that's becoming a thing. Actually, let's see if this is on my video. Yeah, the company I'm working with, it looks like they're not doing anything with medical companies yet, but I could definitely see it becoming a thing in the near future. I actually recently had a conversation with a surgeon who he does not interact with his patients right in front of him. He actually uses robotics. He views everything on a camera that controls robotic arms and fingers to operate on these on his patients, which are much more precise than a human could ever be. So I would imagine something like that is being trained in a virtual environment. And if not now, then definitely in the future.
And the second question I have is that being a gamer of the old generation, Pac-Man.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I noticed once there was, I would say like, I don't know, the first games with a 3D effect.
Mm-hmm.
That is improving, but the quality of the movement, for instance, it was slowed down, and the reaction actually, it was, and it still is, in my opinion, a little bit delayed from what it is. What I mean is that the playability, in my opinion, has lost a little bit compared to the previous games. So my question is, how much do you think that actually in these days we are very much focused on the context, the graphics, more than the content itself of the game? The real thing. I
Yeah.
mean, if you think about a game like Tetris, which is very simple in what it is, and it's been a blast when it came out, or Pac-Man.
Yeah.
What I see in these days is that maybe it's me old being old, but the fantasy behind, I mean, the imagination behind it, it's a bit slow compared to what it was at the beginning. Am I wrong?
Okay, so you're saying that graphical fidelity is taking precedence over fast, satisfying gameplay mechanics? Yeah, I've seen a bit of that too. I feel the same way. I think, in the 90s and even the 80s, we didn't have much room to create a story or things that looked hyper realistic. So the thing that could be good was a very fast, satisfying game mechanic. And I think, yes, since 3D has come out, so much effort and so much focus has been going towards making things look as good as possible and adding very complex, deep stories, which are all great things, but it's sometimes at the expense of good gameplay mechanics. I do think that happens quite a bit, actually. But there's some games still that have that perfect combination of everything. Let's see, have you played any recent games that you are a fan of?
I play sometimes what my kids play, and they play mainly soccer games
Okay.
or driving cars. And what I noticed, for instance, in FIFA, in FIFA 22, for instance, which is fully about soccer, and they've put together. It's not just the football match, but it's also about management. So basically, building your team, and it's not also playing with the others online, but it's mainly what I see from my kids. It's building your team and your club, and creating your stadium, and getting points, and then betting on what you're building up your club. So basically, they're putting together games that when I was a kid, they started existing, like the management, the football manager, football soccer manager, or the actual game of football. So they're putting it together, and I'm not saying it's better or worse. And but for instance, they wanted to have the 22 version compared to 21. And the difference, in my opinion, between one and the other is really, almost unperceivable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you might have one or two new features, but that's kind of a meme that goes around every year. It's like with iPhones, it's the new glass rectangle with a camera that has 0.01% more time zoom. Same thing with games like FIFA 21 versus FIFA 22. Maybe you can add a new haircut for the guy. But yeah, they're extremely similar in it. But they do it for a reason. They can make money off of it every year, so they'll do it. And I think that is why they do it. But I do see your point. Like everything, you can't just jump into a game like Tetris now. There's just so many different components that make up a game now, like the soccer game. Now you have the team management system, and you can play soccer, and you can customize your character. And it's harder for people who have less time to jump into games like those. Whereas any game from the past, in the 90s, even early 2000s, you could start playing your game right away. You didn't have to go through a 2-minute cutscene or design your game, or design your team. So yeah,
it seems like the purpose of the gaming has slightly changed. I mean, you spend also time programming your game, so customizing it more than the game itself. I mean, the game
definitely.
is also customizing it, so which is not necessarily bad. I'm not saying
right. Yeah, I think just with all the different technologies and things you can do in a game, I think the variety of games has increased. There are still like very simple 2D platformers, like Sonic Mania. Sonic the Hedgehog was a huge game in the 90s, and Sega released Sonic Mania, which only came out a few years ago, and it's been their most successful Sonic in at least 15 years, because they know there's an audience for that. Same with casual puzzle games that are, they might have some sort of quick puzzle mechanic. Those are very frequently downloaded and created for mobile apps because it's a perfect platform for it. And then when you get to console games, the games that most kids are playing, they're usually, like you said, it's just endless content. You can do everything in them.
Okay,
Right,
thanks,
thanks for
Matt.
commenting on this. It is interesting because on one hand, it's also bringing our new generation of humanity to think in a different way. So even customizing a program and working on it. So I'm not talking about just the gaming and how you play, but it's also creating a different forma mentis, a way of thinking, how to approach things, which brings us to a different stage on communications, on media, a way of living.
Yeah, definitely. And I really love how things are kind of meshing, like film, animation, and game design. For example, a lot of what our animation program is doing is creating these immersive 3D either landscapes or animations that can be used in a cutscene, or we can use those 3D models in gaming. So yeah, as much as the thought process is kind of meshing, so is the technology.
Thanks, Francesca. Thanks, Matt. And does anyone else have any questions for Matt?
Yeah, I actually have a question.
Great, John, go ahead.
I was just wondering, what do you do, Matt, to kind of like keep a game fresh? Because when it first comes out, it's always the best, but you keep playing it, and after a while, it loses its, you kind of lose enjoyment when you play it. So what would you suggest?
Okay, so I come from like very simple mobile game background, and what I would do is, I'll give you one example from my game Ninjavade. So Ninjavade, you have to unlock new belts, kind of like red belt, yellow belt, all the way up to black belt, and you put a number in front of the user. Maybe they have a high score of 10, and then you tease the next number 20 to unlock the new belt. And every time they unlock something new, you need to provide them a new challenge. So I think the best way is always keeping them challenged and something to strive for. So that's the simple answer for simple games. And I'm thinking of an example of games that I constantly go back to. One of them being Skyrim. Joel, do you by chance play Skyrim or any Elder Scrolls games?
I mean, so yeah, Skyrim came out when I was a fair bit younger, so I kind of I kind of like watched my brother journey through the kind of open world landscape, but
right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so that shows my age there. It still seems new to me. But yeah, Skyrim is a game that I always go back to. And I think it's, we have challenge on one side of the replayability factor, but also if you can build and design a compelling, engaging world, something that somebody wants to come back to, just to roam around, like you said, your brother does, that adds to the replayability. And if there's something always new to explore, if you can put that attention to detail in your game, that's going to keep your players coming back to say, hey, I wonder what's in this corner of the world, or what can I find in this dungeon here that maybe I haven't seen before. Making sure that there's always something new for somebody to explore. With that being said, that all takes more time. So can I ask Joel, are you looking to design a game on your own, or with a team, or are you just kind of just wondering for other developers?
No, I'm actually thinking of designing a game on my own. At the moment I'm kind of want to start with something simple. So I'm looking at iOS development, and I'm going to start with like a simple game with Swift and see what I can do from there.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's the very best way to start designing games, is focus on one simple thing that makes your game unique, your unique selling point. I think the best thing to focus on is some sort of catchy mechanic that is just really addicting, and then build a game around that. And like you said, building something simple and something for mobile is a great way to start. Mobile is the best platform for simple games. And then once you learn the skills of creating gameplay mechanics, building for a platform, submitting it to something like iOS, all those skills are going to be relevant for any more robust projects you take on going forward.
Great, thanks for your advice. And Joel, we look forward to seeing what you create when you make the game. It's exciting for you.
Yeah, Joel, if you ever make progress on it, I'd love to see what you have. I'll put my email in chat.
Thanks, that's really nice, Matt. James.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any final question for Matt before we close our discussion?
I had one, Sarah.
Yeah, Glenn, please go ahead.
No, thanks a lot, Matt. Really interesting. I was just actually was thinking about, as you said, it like mobile, gaming on mobile, and I'm just wondering, as a game developer, how much do you think you would put emphasis on developing, just for the mobile or across platforms? Like, where do you see it going? Like, do you think people will move only to mobile, or no, the PC will always have a place?
That's a really good question. I think everything can be mobile, but you don't necessarily need to build for mobile. So if your game is more about tactility and having the best reflexes, something like Call of Duty, generally your audience is going to be on the console or the PC. That's 90% of their audience. But they also realize mobile is a growing audience too, and there's always someone who would rather play on their mobile or travels a lot, or only has that hardware to play. So they've also developed Call of Duty Mobile. If you're starting off, I would highly recommend starting to develop for mobile, because currently it's the biggest revenue generator of games. Actually, let me see if I can pull something up. But yeah, mobile game design is a great way to start. Yeah, does that answer your question, Glenn?
Certainly does. I know Call of Duty well, as I've looked over my teenage children's shoulders. I've been playing it. So yeah, it's funny you mentioned that one. Anyway, thanks a lot.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, well, if there's no further questions,
actually, if I may, I
yeah,
have
you may. Of course, you may,
more.
Joel. I couldn't see you. You're hiding behind. But please go ahead.
Sorry. Well, I was going to ask first, what's kind of like your general approach to resolving bugs? Because bugs are the worst.
Sure. So to resolve bugs, have you ever heard of a Kanban board or something like Trello or Jira?
I have not.
Okay. So I'd highly encourage it. I use a Kanban board for every project I take on. And essentially what it allows you to do is break down large tasks like building a large project like building a video game, and breaking it down to small manageable tasks, which makes it much more feasible of actually accomplishing if you could just tack each piece of functionality little by little. Companies also use this for resolving bugs. So a common process would be you as a tester would go through whatever game or app that you're testing, and document every single bug or feature that needs to be fixed. You would document it on something like a Trello board, and then just like you would with building a game piece by piece, you would then resolve bugs piece by piece. So it sounds, if you want to get a little bit more technical, it sounds like you might be using Swift to resolve bugs. I'm sorry, to build games. But if you use Unity or Unreal, they provide a console that will show you anytime you have an error. And with Unity, for example, it will tell you what line of code on which script is breaking, and you can literally go to that line of code and fix it right there. So I would need to know more about what those bugs would be, but I will say Unity and Unreal, which are both game engines, they provide really good tools for resolving and finding bugs.
Thanks, Matt. Those sound like top tips. Joe, did you have a follow-up question? I had a feeling you might. Or did I misunderstand?
I mean, I thought about it, but it was kind of answered, so it's not necessary.
Okay, that's perfect. Well, if you do have any other questions for Matt, I'm sure you can reach out. He's kindly shared his email address in the chat. We'd be happy to connect you as well. But other than that, Matt, thank you so much for joining us all the way from St. Louis. And we look very much forward to you joining us in person in fall here in Geneva on our campus. So thanks very much. We wish you a good, I was going to say evening, but for you it will be afternoon, rest of the day, something like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, we'll stay in touch. Thanks very much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, and very nice meeting you all.
Thanks.
All right, see you on the fall.